Massive chaos at Sheremetyevo. Moscow airports are closed. Panic, explosions, and new strikes on Moscow. Muscovites are fleeing the terminals, explosions everywhere.
Whoa, damn, what an outfit.
Another one.
Lights out.
Domodedovo, Vnukovo, Zhukovsky. For almost 7 hours, planes were neither allowed to depart nor to land. Muscovites are sleeping on the floor, arguing and crying. Almost 400 flights have been cancelled or delayed. Thousands of passengers are spending the night right on the floor. In St. Petersburg, there are massive explosions and a large-scale fire. The coastal market has been burning for 3 hours already. Gas cylinders are exploding and the area of the fire is growing. The district is filled with smoke and there are casualties. In the south, there's a new strike on fuel infrastructure. A thermal power plant is on fire in the Smolensk region. There's a massive blackout in Belgorod, explosions and power outages.
I'm heading for Sierra.
Something's blowing up.
There's no power.
Oh, something's blowing up.
Another explosion of the Shadow Fleet in the Black Sea. The Dasan tanker has been destroyed. The damage is critical. The vessel is out of commission. And for the first time during the war, Ukraine has halted the operation of a Russian oil platform in the Caspian Sea. Breaking news, friends. Ukraine is attacking St. Petersburg, Moscow, and the regions with drones around the clock.
We spent the whole week in the basement. Every morning, every night, they just wake us up and throw us into the basement. There it is, the red one.
Oh, damn.
My hands are covered in blood. Look, Elementny is on fire.
There are probably a lot of them.
That's it, over there.
Explosions, panic. Hundreds of thousands of people unable to leave. And for 4 days straight, they fly toward Moscow, turning life in the Kremlin and Moscow into hell.
There it goes, flying.
And the cost of chaos in Russia is measured in billions of rubles. More than $230 million. An air disaster in Russia, which was the result of large-scale drone attacks and strikes on the territory of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other regions.
It's flying. Another one. Svet, please turn it off, damn it. Just turn it off, Svet. You specifically asked me to record this video, but now, look closely. My hands are completely covered in fresh blood.
400 flights have been cancelled.
This is just insane.
People, everything's canceled.
The experience of cancellation.
Airports are paralyzed. Sheremetyevo, Pulkovo, Nizhny. People are crying, spending the night on the floor. Strikes on aviation, the strategic base in Engels, the tactical one in Borisogledsk, the fleet in Novorossiysk, as well as the Pacific Fleet, are all under attack. But who is paying for all this? What does this mean personally for Russians and the market? Let's find out now from the well-known economist and professor Igor Lipsitz. The damage from the cover plan is estimated at more than 20 billion rubles. That's 236 million. That's the estimate. How do you assess the economic losses and what does this mean for Russia?
Well, look, Russia is a rather complicated country when it comes to transportation. It's long, you know. In geography, there's the concept of round countries where generally it's not very far to get from the center to any point. There are long countries and Russia is a long country. For it, the transportation system is extremely important. And the problem now is that Russia's civil aviation is in crisis. Passenger transportation isn't coping very well either. So now, after these last 24 hours in the airports, that story has already happened. People rushed to the railway to at least get to St. Petersburg by train. Everything was bought up instantly. They're trying to urgently add extra carriages. You can't tell how this will end. Basically, the transportation connectivity is kind of falling apart. And these losses for Russian civil aviation are already quite an unpleasant topic. Russian civil aviation, in general, it's not exactly, to put it mildly, a profitable sector, but rather a loss-making one. The point is that, well, Russian aviation was set up in such a way that it made money on some very specific. First of all, Aeroflot had good income from international contacts. All foreign companies that flew through Russian airspace paid for it. But transport routes to Asia and back passed through Russia, and Aeroflot received payment for the use of Russian airspace for transit flights. Now that's almost gone. If you look at an air traffic map, say on Flight Radar, you'll see that there are noticeably fewer planes in Russian airspace. Traces, of course, that income has disappeared. Next, Russian companies used to earn a lot by flying Russian tourists all over the world. But now Russian tourists have suddenly stopped traveling abroad. There's no need to say that some people are still going to Dubai or Egypt. Those flows are nothing like what they used to be. Even the demand for foreign currency in Russia has sharply decreased, precisely because essentially it's almost dead, overseas tourism. Accordingly, airlines can't transport passengers. And there used to be huge revenues. In the summer, there was a flood of charter flights that airlines made money on. Now that's gone. And domestic flights within Russia aren't very profitable. They're loss-making. And to this day, the Russian government subsidizes domestic flights so that Russians can travel around the country. Because if people can't move around the country, then it's not really a country. In other words, there's no sense of it being a unified country if you can't get anywhere. But right now, that's exactly the situation that's taking shape. No amount of money can solve the security problems in Russia's major airports. As a result, they are starting to break down. Huge losses for Russian airlines. I repeat, they're already in a difficult situation as it is. What they'll do next is unclear. Of course, they'll be asking the government for subsidies, and that would be fair because it's the government that got them into this mess. It was the government that started the war, not the airlines. Now the airlines are suffering, but I'm afraid they won't get any money. Because right now, there's no money for anything except the war. And we're already seeing this line of those in need who go to the Ministry of Finance to ask for money, and they're being turned down. Well, for example, there was already a case. Right now, Russia's coal industry is in a huge crisis. To support it, they introduced reduced tariffs for coal transportation. But then the losses fell on Russian railways, RZD. RZD came to the government basically crying out, asking for subsidies to cover the losses we're incurring so that Russia's coal industry doesn't die out quickly. We said, you weren't part of this and didn't give them any subsidies, and so on. So in this sense, plugging the hole in the airline industry's economy will generally be difficult. That's why I think we're going to see some very unpleasant stories related to the bankruptcy of Russian airlines and industry consolidation. And soon, possibly only Aeroflot will remain in Russia, while the other airlines apparently won't survive. But I think that's the picture.
Igor Vladimirovich, what about the lack of connectivity, the non-working internet, YouTube? We've noticed that after the special operation Web, even Russian war correspondents report that not only in major cities, but across all of Russia, communication and internet are being jammed. This is how they are trying to fight against special operations and Ukrainian intelligence services. How does this affect the lives of ordinary Russians?
Well, it means that Russians are finally dropping out of global civilization. This might seem like a strange topic, but right now, I have a friend. We went to Russia to visit their parents for a while. And with horror, they say that they've ended up in some kind of, black zone. Nothing works. Nothing is possible. We can't connect to the outside world at all. They say we try one VPN after another. Not a single VPN works. After the first connection, the second one is immediately blocked and doesn't go through. The VPN tries to diagnose, but it just doesn't work. So basically, you end up, how can I put it, in a soundproof room. You can't connect with the world in any way. You can't communicate with anyone. You can't work remotely. You're trapped inside Russia's information space. And overall, of course, it's a terrible situation and it has a significant impact. I've really noticed this. My YouTube views have dropped because many Russians simply can't watch anymore. Now I've switched, I record all my streams. I also make audio files, and I've created a special audio channel on Telegram so that people can at least listen to my interviews, including yours, which will be available in audio format. Audio from Telegram can still be listened to directly somehow. But watching is no longer possible. In other words, people are being cut off from gaming sites. As you can see, people are being cut off from WhatsApp, from Telegram, and gradually people are being cut off from YouTube as well. And basically, it's becoming a closed system. I would say that an informational concentration camp is being formed. Russians used to shout that the war didn't affect them in any way, that it was happening somewhere out on the fringes. This is a special military operation. It has nothing to do with us at all. But now the war has reached them quite directly through the cancellation of flights and the disappearance of the ability to live in the information space. Well, as they say, you reap what you sow.
Dear audience, Igor Vladimirovich has just asked a question. We're interested in the geography of our viewers. Where are you watching us from? Write your location in the comments. Which city and which country are you from? How are you watching us? Are you using a VPN or not? Write a few kind words in support of Ukraine. How is your connection? Because we work for an audience all over the world so that they know the truth about Russian aggression and Russia's war against Ukraine. That's why every comment and every subscription from you means that you are on the side of light. Igor Vladimirovich, regarding an important topic is the attacks on airfields from an economic and military perspective. How much does it actually cost to restore infrastructure after a strike in Engels, Borisogledsk, after strikes on key military strategic airfields during Operation Web? And how do such strikes on strategic aviation in general affect the military budget and Russia's ability to keep fighting for years to come?
Well, look, the situation is quite interesting. So there was a report that Russia is trying to expand a plant for the production of technical bombers. Well, because up to now, Russian aviation has, in general, lost this capability. Well, how should I put it? Russia was once a very great, powerful, and renowned aviation power. There were quite good designers and there were good combat aircraft. And we remember this situation. I even remember from my childhood all these stories about significant dogfights in the skies over Korea and Vietnam, where Soviet pilots, disguising themselves as Vietnamese, fought against American pilots. Back then, it was quite an even war, quite significant. And at that time, it seemed that Russian aviation would always be a very powerful industry. But then the decline began somewhere in the 1990s. And in general, the Russian aviation industry never really recovered from that collapse. And now it has found itself in a certain predicament because, as they say, they're just flying out the last of their resources, squeezing out what's left. They're logging flight hours on old planes. It's difficult to build new planes now, including both civilian and military aircraft. It's hard to produce them because there just aren't the capabilities. Well, how can I put it? A lot has been lost. It's not a very fast or noticeable process for people, this process of degradation. When you talk about it, people are often surprised. What degradation are you talking about? But people are still doing things, you see. And when the older generation starts to leave, it's important that the next generation comes in. Designers, engineers, technologists, skilled workers, those who will take over the production capabilities. That's when the industry survives. In Russia, this is a complete disaster because basically there are no personnel, neither engineers nor workers. And this isn't something I'm making up. Take a look. Chemysov, the head of Rostec, stated this quite clearly just recently. He said that there is a huge shortage of personnel for the military industry in Russia. And what will come of this, we don't know. So far, all this talk about how we'll reproduce and start making strategic bombers again and so on, it's all a complicated story because the industry has to be capable of doing it. But that's not the sense we get because we see a simple picture. For example, nothing is working out in civil aviation. Russia can't launch new airplanes, and it desperately, vitally needs new planes. They start some projects, like the MC-21, trying to make a new two-plane, some regional aircraft like the Baikal, but nothing is working out. So much has been destroyed, so much lost, that it's extremely difficult to restore. And even the combat aircraft that Russia had, like the Su series, are already starting to fall behind. Well, simply because the electronics are outdated, and they don't have their own electronics. That's why, of course, the losses are practically irrecoverable, because Russia's industrial capabilities now simply don't allow for such easy restoration. They can produce the simplest types of weapons, like ammunition, some uncomplicated ones. They've learned how to make drones, but when it comes to something very complex, apparently it's already not really possible to restore. And at this point, even money won't help. It's not about lacking money to restore the fleet of strategic bombers. You can provide the money, but it's just not possible to make them anymore.
Ilya Vladimirovich, regarding the tanker fleet, we understand there have been strikes on bases in Novorossiysk in the Far East, and there was also an incident with a tanker in St. Petersburg. What is the economic scale of the losses at the naval bases in the Far East? Is this an apocalypse for both raw material exports and logistics chains?
Overall, the situation with maritime exports is becoming very complicated. I can't say it's a catastrophe yet, but the situation is getting bad. Several problems have emerged, so to speak. The first problem is that European countries have actually decided to start inspecting Russian ships. And in fact, this has been discussed, for some time. Since February or March of last year, I wrote about this at the time as well. There was a certain directive from the European Union, well, maybe not a directive, that's a strong word, but recommendations from the EU to Denmark to enforce strict control over the passage of tankers carrying Russian oil through the Danish Straits. Well, basically, the Danes, at the time, they were quite perplexed and taken aback and showed no readiness whatsoever. They said it would be very difficult for them to do. In reality, though, making it harder for these ships to pass is entirely possible if there were the will to do so. As you can see now, this scenario is starting to play out. NATO ships are planning to inspect these ships here, the ones transporting Russian oil, to check if they meet the requirements. For this kind of sailing in the Baltic, insurance, and so on, if the insurance requirements are not met, the ships will automatically be blacklisted. That is, even without any special decisions from NATO or the US. And then they will be under sanctions and will face major problems. That's why there's a risk that a very large share of the shadow fleet that Russia has created will simply become inoperable. We've already heard the numbers. Of course, it's difficult to verify all this because, you see, we're talking about things that aren't very obvious and are rather secretive. There are only some indirect estimates, and that's what I'm relying on. Up to 400 ships are already on this blacklist, and they're already being refused service. And accordingly, these vessels are mostly docked, laid up, anchored, or at the roadstead, whatever you want to call it. Use whatever term you like, but they're not sailing. If this list expands now, Russia will face major problems. But still, if they manage to push through, if this idea of lowering the price cap to 45, which is part of the 18th package, goes through, then there will be even greater difficulties, and Russian maritime exports will fall even further. Combined with low oil prices, this would be a very serious blow to Russia's financial situation, to the Russian budget, and to spending on everyday life in Russia. This, of course, is already a path leading to an extremely serious crisis situation in Russia's economy.
Igor Vladimirovich, you brought up a very important topic. Yes, this includes the Shadow Fleet, the 18th package of sanctions, and the position of the United States. There's no talk yet about lowering it to $30 at all. And as for the Shadow Fleet, which Europe still isn't fighting against, well, the German Chancellor came out recently and said that Germany will strengthen control over the Shadow Fleet in the Baltic Sea. As
you know, right now only Slovakia and Hungary are blocking it, but the European Union in this regard is starting to learn something and is working out ways to bypass these blockades from Hungary and Slovakia because they are always opposed. This is practically a fifth column within the European Union. I don't understand how they can put up with this. Moving on, the European Union, but that's their problem. Therefore, of course, there may be some solutions and they might still manage to implement this price cap. And that would already be significant because then, well, as they say, America is far away. But here, they're coming right around Europe. Yes, they leave from Ust-Luga and go around Europe. And accordingly, if not a single European port will service them, they will have quite serious problems. And the US doesn't even benefit from this. You mentioned the word benefit. Yes, no, the US gains nothing from Russia exporting oil. But there are some idiotic concepts from Trump, like not quarreling with Putin, thinking that at some point he'll come to his senses and eventually agree to end the war. That's a rather strange concept. But Trump had such dreams to resolve this conflict quickly and to get the Nobel Prize for it, which he just can't bring himself to give up on completely. He's even starting to grumble that Putin isn't living up to his expectations, but nevertheless, he still doesn't want to impose a sanctions regime against Russia. He hopes that Putin will eventually come to his senses and for his own benefit will back down and retreat. Of course, this is an illusion. This will not happen. But unfortunately, what you are saying means a very simple thing. By the way, this has already been voiced by the leadership of the European Union. They said that we must understand that the West, as we used to know it, no longer exists. That is, this unified bloc of countries ready to somehow contain Russia's aggression does not exist. There is the European Union as a separate entity, and there is Europe as a whole, as a certain unity of states, whether or not they are part of the EU. And the United States exists as a separate territory. This is the reality we are living in now.
Ignat Ilyich, but still, if we model the situation, what if the European Union decides to vote for the 18th package of sanctions? How much of this will actually be implemented in practice, considering the shadow fleet and the position of the US? You were absolutely right to say that from an economic standpoint, America's position is unclear. I also talked to economists, and they say that Trump's logic is incomprehensible. This is purely a political decision.
Of course, but look, you have to understand that the price cap is still at 60 Russian oil. Well, for now, you see, I'm talking about very indirect figures, but we live in a country that has classified all statistics, so it's very difficult. But still, apparently, right now, Russian exports are going at a price of about 52 to 53, which is below the cap. And that means Greek ships are transporting the oil. Greek ship owners are making money. They always try to help out and earn for themselves. They've made money off Russia more than once. They were transporting oil as far back as 1922. They were extremely active, and before the price cap was introduced, they made huge amounts of money. Then they sold their old tankers to Russia, and as I understand it, this entire so-called shadow fleet consists of former Greek tankers, just the ones that were due to be decommissioned. Well, look, the point is that Russia's shadow fleet consists of old rust buckets. That's what they're called. Because you see, an oil tanker is supposed to be operated for 12 to 15 years. After that, it starts to become quite dangerous, rusts, and all sorts of other nasty problems begin to happen to it. And usually they're sent off to be scrapped for metal, but the Greeks managed to sell their old ships to Russia for quite large sums, billions in fact. And now these shadow fleet vessels of the Russian fleet are tankers that are 25 to 30 years old. They're dangerous, they're environmentally hazardous, which is why Europe is starting to get nervous, even though Europe is generally rather slow and indecisive. But everyone understands that if there are any major spills, then in general, all of Europe and everyone around the Baltic will be in serious trouble. That's why at least there is some movement happening. We'll see what comes of it, because Russia has also started deploying warships to escort these tankers. This is, of course, a very interesting situation because these ships aren't sailing under the Russian flag. It's one thing if I'm escorting a vessel sailing under the Russian flag, but if it's some Liberian ship and I'm protecting it for some reason, then an interesting question arises. Why exactly are you guarding it? A Liberian ship? What kind of joy do you get from doing that? So, of course, there could be some very unpleasant conflicts here, naval ones. We'll see how it all ends. But the very fact that NATO ships have started going out and inspecting these oil tankers is, of course, an interesting development and overall proper management. So, if the price cap is set at 45, the Greeks will stop transporting. They're afraid of this because nobody wants to end up under sanctions. A vessel that falls under sanctions can practically no longer operate. Even if it carries other cargo, once it's sanctioned, it's basically lost. But no one wants to lose their assets, so if the cap is set at 45 now, the Greeks will again stop transporting Russian oil. This would be a very significant blow to Russian oil exports and consequently to budget revenues.
Igor Vladimirovich, regarding American sanctions, a 500% tariff from the US seems like an unrealistic scenario. But what about Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham? Do you think they might lower it, make it 20%, 50%, or 100% for secondary sanctions on countries that buy Russian gas, oil, petroleum products, or raw materials like China and India? And then those countries would simply stop doing it. What do you think?
Well, first of all, let's see in what form the bill will be passed. Because bills change. Right now, they've passed the big, beautiful bill. And some things have already been dropped from it, right? There were a few rather outrageous provisions that were dropped during the approval process because they were just completely insane. And in the end, they were thrown out since, well, European countries made it clear to the US that if those were adopted, the response would be so harsh, it would be hard to handle. In that sense, the US would face very strong counter-sanctions, and it would be better if those provisions did not make it through. For example, one of the sections, I think it was the 899th, was simply thrown out. So let's see in what form the big, beautiful bill was passed. And now let's look at Lindsey Graham, how this bill will be adopted. I'll put it this way. I paid attention to Graham's words after he played golf. Just think about how absurd our lives have become. We're discussing politicians' statements after playing golf with the President of the United States. This is just some kind of a debased political system. But here we are, forced to live in this vulgar politics, in this vulgar political world. It's terrible, disgusting. So he said something like, wait, we had a talk with the president, at least he didn't use the word chatted. But that's basically how their mechanics work. And by the way, Trump's vocabulary is pretty much the same, like a street thug's. So we talked with the president, and our task is to speed up the adoption of the bill to arm them. The president with this bill. So if we translate this into concrete terms, it means that this bill started out as a direct action bill, introducing 500% tariffs for countries buying Russian energy resources, but most likely it will be passed as a secondary action law, granting the US president the right to impose such tariffs. And whether he will impose them or not, well, just look at Trump, how he sometimes imposes things and sometimes doesn't. So I would say that the bill was a big swing, Lindsey Graham's bill, but in reality, it could end up being just an absolutely meaningless piece of paper. Igor Vladimirovich?
As for inflation and poverty and the overall risk of social unrest, right now we're seeing conflicts around us involving minorities. All of this may even be connected to the construction sector. I spoke with an economist, and he said that the worse the Russian economy performs, the more representatives of ethnic minorities will start forming their own power blocks, and there will be certain military or paramilitary conflicts. That's how tactfully he put it. regarding inflation and poverty. Is there a risk of a new wave of poverty and social unrest within Russia? I'm interested in your opinion.
The risk of poverty is high. I should have an article coming out in the next few days. Maybe it's even out today. I haven't checked yet, in Republic, where I discuss this. So at the St. Petersburg Forum, Putin declared that Russia is entering an era, a high-wage economy. Incredibly beautiful words, absolutely false, absolutely meaningless, but beautifully said. He's a real master of political demagoguery. In reality, Russia is actually entering a period of declining living standards because wage growth in Russia has stopped, while the cost of living is rising significantly this year. Well, maybe not for the very first time, but it's the first really serious one, and apparently there will be more to come. But the first really serious one is the increase in utility tariffs. Right now, I'm getting letters from all over the country about how much their rates have gone up. I think the record was in the Omsk region, 40%. Today, someone sent me another case, 29% increase in tariffs somewhere else. This, of course, is a very serious blow because far from everyone has seen their salaries grow in recent years. Many public sector workers receive such weak compensation for inflation that they've been getting poorer for a long time now and no longer understand how they're going to survive. That's why, of course, Russia is now entering a period of impoverishment, and many people who used to be middle class are becoming poor. They write letters to me too saying, we used to feel like we were solidly middle class. At the very least, we could basically afford everything. All the goods needed for a normal family life. Once a year, we would go abroad on vacation to relax, and everything was great. But now we can't even go into regular stores, supermarkets anymore. And now we go to the cheapest, most bare-bones supermarkets like Svetofor or Pobeda, where the prices are rock bottom, but the quality of the products is completely questionable. You never know if you'll survive eating this stuff or not. So that's the picture. It's like we've suddenly become poor. We're no longer middle class, we've become poor. And this is a situation that's only going to get worse. Because most likely there will be even more budget cuts and people will start to suffer because of it. Maybe it will become even more pronounced and severe. This is a trend that has already taken shape. There are delays in wage payments. This is a very unpleasant topic for Russians. But that period of so-called happiness for the country is over, and now an unhappy one has begun. And Herman Greff has already spoken about this. He said that they are receiving quite a lot of requests from individuals who took out loans from Sberbank asking for a deferral on loan repayments. And in a quarter of the cases, this is because people simply aren't being paid their wages. They say, we would pay off the loan, but we haven't received our salary, so we can't pay. So you see, this is already happening at the Sberbank level. This trend has taken shape. Non-payments are on the rise. Now they've raised utility rates, and among 5 million Russians, there is already 1 trillion rubles in unpaid utility bills. And now it's quite difficult to pay this off because, generally speaking, people no longer have such earnings. And as you know, late fees are also accumulating there. That's why the late fees are calculated based on the central bank's rate. There are many concepts involved. So in this sense, people will be drowning in debt and will have their electricity cut off. And the gas will be shut off as well. And Russian cities will start turning into, how should I put it, well, into rather uncivilized places to live. This will lead to people trying to find ways to cope. A year and a half ago, when I said that people should start thinking about getting wood stoves for their homes, everyone had a good laugh at my words. They said, what is this professor talking about? How could you possibly have wood stoves in apartment buildings? How would you even get firewood up to the top floor? But now, of course, this is becoming very relevant. For now, people have started bringing gas cylinders into their apartments, which is why explosions have started happening in apartments. Well, that's because people aren't very skilled at handling gas. They've installed gas stoves, you see. They brought in gas cylinders, and basically they're trying to cope somehow. Apparently the gas was cut off, so they're trying to save money to survive somehow. Well, all of this ends in explosions. Recently, there were 3 explosions in just one day. Household gas exploded, the cylinders blew up. How did a gas cylinder end up in an apartment building? The building is already supplied with gas, so where did the cylinder come from? So they're replacing it. This is the kind of situation that's going to happen, and Russian cities will turn into, how should I put it, ghettos for the poor. Well, will these events cause some kind of social discontent? Probably, but it will be very localized. It will be some kind of outrage against the mayor, at most against the governors, but not any serious social unrest. It won't escalate, well, maybe just gradually. It will get to the point where roads are blocked. Well, that's when other kinds of events will start happening. So keep an eye on when they start blocking railways and federal highways in Russia. That's when it will be clear that Russia is slowly starting to boil over. For now, we don't see that happening. And
Vladimir Vladimirovich, the final topic I wanted to discuss with you today. We see that, among other things, because of Trump's policies, Putin has started using drone and missile terror. Our military command says that in the future, it will be 1,000 drones per day, and this will happen regularly, several times a week, maybe even more. In general, Putin is ramping up production. And here I'd like to look at it from an economic and military perspective. I'd like to ask you, how much longer can the military machine keep carrying out this terror against Ukraine and even scale it up?
So scaling up probably isn't very likely, but continuing is possible because, of course, notice that Putin said Russia is already excessively burdened by military spending and that military expenses need to be reduced. He said this in Minsk. But I don't think they'll cut all military spending to the maximum. They'll reduce spending on the production of certain types of weapons that aren't very effective. For example, it's unlikely that new Russian tanks will be produced, as you can imagine. This weapon hasn't performed very well. Russian tanks. No one has seen any Armata tanks on the battlefield, as you can see, even though there were claims that it was a terrifying tank that would guarantee victory for the Russian army and that everything would be accomplished instantly. None of that happened. But they are producing drones. They are ramping up production of this kind of simple equipment. They are sourcing some electronics through China, and this will continue. As long as Russia doesn't collapse, Russia will keep producing a lot of weapons, and you'll have to fight against that. In this sense, even very poor regions are capable of producing weapons. Look at Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians have destroyed their own economy and their population lives in poverty. But all sorts of nasty, vile military means. They produce them and periodically try to launch them. What does Israel do? It creates the Iron Dome. It develops lasers for interception. I think that Ukraine has only one option: to keep developing increasingly powerful air defense systems and destroy as many launched weapons as possible. As for assuming that Russia will suddenly weaken and stop producing these weapons, I wouldn't count on that for now.
Dear audience, please like this video, write a few kind words in support of Ukraine in the comments, and subscribe to Igor Lips's YouTube channel. This is very important. The link will be in the description. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, Dasha Shaslivaya. We work for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression, about Russia's war against Ukraine. Today, we discuss the war economy and the ability of the Russian military machine to continue waging war with a well-known economist and professor. See you next time. Thank you.
All the best. Goodbye.